Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. Britain right now is in the process of implementing a very authoritarian bathroom ban that would exclude trans people from most single-sex spaces, effectively barring an already vulnerable minority from public life. I wrote an article about this recently for Liberal Currents entitled Britain's Bathroom Ban, and one of the resources I drew on to help me understand what is quite a complex legal reality right now was the Good Law Project. They are a legal organisation that, amongst other things, is the main group challenging this in court. I reached out to them and asked if someone from there would like to come on my podcast to discuss this fight, and I was very fortunate that they agreed. Their founder and director, Jolyon, came on and had a conversation, which is the episode that you're about to listen to. It's an overview of where we are at generally in terms of trans rights in the UK. What specifically is going on with this bathroom ban as I've described it, and what obligations do we think that creates for the rest of us living in this country. I'll mention very quickly that this is a evolving situation, which is very unclear, and even just in the last week, there's been a couple of updates with this. So just as we were recording, the EHRC represented itself in court in a way that is very different to how they have represented their position in the interim guidance. We discussed that a bit in this episode. Since we recorded, they've actually withdrawn the interim guidance. That doesn't mean that the policy won't still happen. They are still pushing for Bridget Phillipson to adopt the code of practice, but it does mean the current legal reality, like who is allowed to use what bathroom, is even less clear than it was before. I won't speculate here on why I think that's happened or what it means for where we're going, except to say now would be a very, very good time to raise your political voice on this. So if you listen to this episode and agree with us that this is a heinous use of state power, I would very strongly encourage you to write to your MP about it, for instance, or speak up politically in any way that seems right to you and using any tools that you have. As always, if you enjoy my work and think it's valuable, please do consider supporting me. Everything I do really is made possible by the support I get on Patreon, so consider adding to that for any amount. And while I'm making requests of you, also please do consider supporting organisations like the Good Law Project that are fighting the good fight for basic liberal rights and freedoms in the UK right now. Okay, so let's get straight to it. This is Fighting Britain's Bathroom Ban with Jolyon. I am joined today by Jolyon, the founder and director of the Good Law Project. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Totally a pleasure.
So let's just start with what's going on in Britain. Just as an FYI to you, I'm probably about half and half American and UK audience here, or like equal thirds American, UK, and everyone else. I recently had an article called Britain's Bathroom Ban, where I was being slightly provocative by using an American term, but I don't think ridiculously so, given what our government has been saying they are going to implement. In the simplest possible terms, what's going on here? What are we doing at the moment with this?
You started with a question that's internally contradictory. What's going on here is very, very complicated. It's baffling legally, it's baffling politically, it's baffling ethically. And there is no way to put it in simple terms. I mean, each of those questions or each of those dimensions to the question itself requires quite a lot of unpacking. Um,
I think this will be
if
most of the interview. I set out to write. I set out to write 1,000 words on here's what Americans need to know of just the basics of this, and it morphed into 8,000 like that. Um, do you have a starting point to lead people through the maze?
ye, so I think your UK audience will have some vague sense of what's going on. I probably don't need to address my answer to them. Your US, and I liked your sort of multinational corporate reporting formulation, your US and ROW audiences might need something of a clue. The kind of defining feature of the landscape is that, unlike in the rest of the world, in the United Kingdom, there is a material constituency that thinks of itself as being on the left, that is nevertheless transphobic. And that feature has made the United Kingdom very, very interesting to well-funded organizations that are weaponizing transphobia. So there's quite a lot of evidence of Russian interest in this issue. We may remember Vladimir Putin singing the praises of J.K. Rowling.
Mhm.
And it's very clear that there's a lot of US funding of the transphobic campaigners in the United Kingdom. Um, and the United Kingdom is particularly interesting in the US because there is still a sense in which Britain is a country of good governance. And certainly the UK is a country where politics can be influenced cheaply, certainly cheaply relative to the US. So money is coming into the UK to create precedents, um, be they legal precedents or medical precedents, that can be used to shift the debate in the United States and indeed in the rest of the world. Um, so it's the presence of those features, I think, that have made the United Kingdom the arguably, I think, um, quite clearly on some aspects, arguably the most transphobic country in the uh, global minority, if you like, in or the West to adopt that shorthand.
What specifically are we in the process of doing right now?
So uh, there is a big push by the notionally independent human rights regulator charged with securing the rights and dignities of particularly minoritized groups to exclude, at the very least, to exclude trans people from using the spaces of their acquired genders. Um, and probably it would be fair to say to exclude trans people from public life altogether by making it impossible for them to move through the public sphere. I mean, there was an extraordinary hostility on the part of the Equality and Human Rights Commission to trans people enjoying any rights or dignities at all. This has happened under the chairing of a political appointee of Liz Truss. So this is a woman called Kishwa Faulkner. Successive Conservative ministers boasted about how they had stuffed Britain's institutions, relevantly here, including the Equality and Human Rights Commission, with those who shared their views on trans people. Um, and we are seeing things like bathroom bans. It's interesting to reflect on how quickly all of this has happened. In 2019, the
Yes.
then Conservative leader, Theresa May, promised in Parliament to make it easier for trans people to legally change their gender, and no one cared. Roll the clock forward 6 years to 2025, and it is now, um, as presently understood, the law that trans women should not use women's bathrooms. Um, and you think back to, I think it was 2016 when North Carolina introduced an inverted commas bathroom ban. And in Britain, we issued a travel advisory warning to trans people. They should not go to North Carolina because they would not be able to live in dignity, visit North Carolina in dignity, and yet, 9 years on, it is now official policy of a notionally centre-left government.
This is, and we'll return to this, this is one of the elements I find most striking about the UK case, is the speed of travel. Um, let's, I tell you what, let me give a very concise summary of sort of the nominal process through which we got here. I don't want to spend the whole interview getting lost in the legal side of things, which is a bit hard to wrap your head around anyway, as you said. But so what led the EHRC, the human rights body that you mentioned, to this is a Supreme Court ruling called For Women Scotland, which was asked a reasonably narrow question of, is a piece of legislation called the 2010 Equality Act, when it says woman and man, does it mean biological woman or is it using trans inclusive definitions? For whatever reason, the Supreme Court decided that it meant biological man or biological woman, although there's pretty strong contextual reasons to think that it didn't. Nonetheless, that's what the Supreme Court held. So in itself, that's a bit of an overreach. But this is not the American Supreme Court, where it makes these big, vast, sweeping constitutional decisions. Our Supreme Court doesn't work that way. But what did happen, though, is a number of politicians and bodies, most principally the EHRC, took that Supreme Court case as saying that the Supreme Court had now effectively said this is what man and women mean for all of UK law, and this has these sweeping consequences for any single sex space. So my kind of simple non-lawyer's understanding is that it's like a double leapfrog or like a double overread. The Supreme Court overreads or imposes a new reading on the 2010 Equality Act, and then the EHRC imposes an overreading on that overreading. And we end up with a radically new legal reality while nominally not having changed the law at all. But in practice, of course, it's very, very different. That's my non-expert overview. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty good actually. Maybe I could just reflect on those two steps.
Please.
The Supreme Court decision was really, truly appalling. So let me make good on that assertion. Goodall Project took advice from three King's Counsel in three different sets of chambers, all of whom said the case brought by this transphobic campaign group that styles itself as for women in Scotland, I style it as for some women in Scotland. All of those three KCs said that their case was unarguable. It was doomed to fail. They got before a Supreme Court, which did a number of entirely remarkable things. So it's the final court of appeal. It nevertheless allowed fresh evidence to be adduced, fresh evidence that it did not allow anyone to test. Some of that evidence that was before it and which it accepted was plainly wrong. So it made some statements about lesbians' dignity being jeopardized by the inclusion of trans women in so-called women's spaces. But there's polling by a very highly respected polling organization that shows that there is no demographic in Britain that is more supportive of trans inclusion than lesbian women. So, the numbers are strikingly high. It's like 80% or something like that of lesbians are trans inclusive. Doesn't stop there. Supreme Court has a mandatory duty to interpret the Equality Act, this bit of legislation that you mentioned, consistently with the United Kingdom's international human rights obligations. It just ignored that mandatory obligation. Um, there were no trans people before the Supreme Court. So you had a transphobic appellant, you had the Scottish government as the respondent to For Some Women Scotland's appeal. A whole bunch of, in inverted commas, gender critical organisations were permitted to intervene. Good Law Project organised an intervention by the two architects of the Gender Recognition Act, a trans woman and a trans man, with an incredibly powerful legal team, so that the Supreme Court would have some trans voices before it. And the Supreme Court refused to hear their intervention. So a whole series of quite outrageous things that the Supreme Court did, and which have caused one of those would-be interveners, a woman called Victoria MacLeod, who was until she retired because she felt unsupported by the judicial superstructure, who was until then Britain's only out trans judge. She is taking a case to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, saying that the process by which the Supreme Court arrived at that decision is procedurally unfair. Here I am going to speculate. I'm going to say things that I do not know to be true. But one of the features of Britain is its extraordinary level of social immobility and the very, very narrow footprint of people who hold cultural and political power, many of whom went to the same schools, the same universities. And that class immobility is particularly strong in our judiciary. So an organisation called the Sutton Trust has pointed out that the judiciary is the least diverse part of a not terribly diverse British public life. And I'm stressing that point because, if you're drawing up Venn diagrams of people who are opposed to the rights and dignities of trans people, there are lots of other sets of people that intersect with that set of transphobes. But one that's particularly important to note is people with enormous privilege. and there is, looked at as a monolith at least, no group that is more privileged than than our senior judiciary. Um, and personally, I'm quite heartbroken by this. I'm heartbroken in part because I'm a lawyer. I'm a King's Counsel. It's a sort of foundational belief of mine that the law should be fair. The law is an instrument for good, for justice, not for punching down. Um, but I'm also heartbroken because I know personally very well one of those judges. One of those judges is somebody that I used to routinely have dinner with at one another's houses. I argued cases against them when we were both still at the bar. And and I just don't know what to say to them. I've got their WhatsApp, I could send them an email, but I cannot understand how they have done this thing, which is so clearly substantively wrong, and in a way which is so offensive to lawyers' understandings of proper judicial process. There's a very, very senior lawyer who I won't name because it would embarrass her, but most people's idea of the leading um, barrister of her generation, who has started saying that the US Supreme Court system is better because at least you know what their politics are before you get into court. Um, this is not somebody who is a radical. And I think quite a lot of the profession, the legal profession and the judicial profession, are really angry with this, um, what looks to us like ideologically driven judicial overreach. We can see in the data actually um, extraordinary levels of distrust in the judiciary amongst many, many minoritized demographics. Um, that was your first point. Your second point was about the creation of a narrative. So after
Let's actually pause it there because I really like that point. So and I really agree with it. I'm much less knowledgeable when it comes to the social composition of the judiciary, although what you're saying strikes me as pretty intuitive. I would say there's a very close analog there, and a similar sort of there's a very close analog there with the media, because the media, I can also cite statistics to you, something I believe like 80% of the British media come from upper class backgrounds. I don't have that to hand, but it's high. It's one of the least socially mobile professions in the UK. And I think it goes to a narrative we've had throughout what I call the Trump era, but an era of sort of, it gets framed as rising far right populism, of there's been a narrative persistently the whole time that this is a bottom up backlash to the excesses of social liberalism. And by social liberalism is almost always meant something about trans people, right? But the narrative would go, all these woke kids on college campuses and like gender weirdos with their pronouns went way too far, and the builders and plumbers of the world got outraged and started voting for Trump and Brexit. That's that's the dominant narrative we've had. And the UK case shows how completely opposite it is with trans people, because we've never had, to the same degree that America has had, an organized sort of hardcore evangelical religious right opposed to gay, lesbian, transgender people. And I mean, it's there, but it's not nowhere near as politically significant as it is in the US. Um, and as you said, we have had legal gender recognition since 2004. In the 2019 election, all the main parties, including the Tories, ran on streamlining that process. It only became an issue, and it never, in the whole of that period, it never even appeared on voters' top 10 list of issues. This was not a bot. That's not to say every voter was wonderfully tolerant and open. They just didn't care. It wasn't something that was on their radar. Um, it wasn't a thing. There wasn't this popular bottom-up backlash. Trans people did not invent themselves in the year of our Lord 2018. No, what happened is the media decided, for perhaps some of the reasons you alluded to at the beginning of this interview, but also I think, how big is the British elite really? Like, how many, PPE and law grads do Oxford and Cambridge churn out a year? Like, for whatever reason, the British elite just really got it into their head that, like, this was a human rights issue for women, and they were going to prosecute, and they just didn't like trans people, and they were going to prosecute it aggressively.
I don't,
And
I don't, I don't quite agree with that characterization. Um, a lot of the leading um, female or cis female campaigners against trans rights were voiceless um, when they were talking about rape, were deplatformed when they were talking about domestic abuse, um, were unheard when they were talking about where the burden of austerity fell in gendered terms, but were picked up as soon as they started talking about transphobia.
no, no, I,
Uh,
I agree with that. Perhaps I could have been clearer that I don't. When I say this is happening under the aegis of concern for women and girls, that is at very best, very selective.
it's very convenient to the patriarchy, isn't it, for trans people to be the poster child for the extraordinarily destructive effects of patriarchal values on the lives of young and older girls and women.
Yeah. But again, though, that just goes to my point that this isn't a bottom-up backlash, it's top-down. Like, the people at the to decide what's going to be the main news have decided, as you say, well, these concerns about rape or poverty, that we're not going to elevate those. But to the extent anyone's saying something about trans people, we're definitely going to elevate that. But again, that is a top-down decision.
Yeah, and I think so I've just come back from a conference in Winnipeg where I've been talking, amongst others, about how we address this. There's this sort of belief amongst some on the progressive side of politics that we need to message this better. We need to find new ways to talk about being trans or the need to preserve the dignity of trans people or whatever it is. And a lot of that, I think, overlooks the brute power of money. So the Trump side spent
Yeah.
more than $200 million during the presidential campaign alone on anti-trans messaging. So $134, if I remember correctly, for every trans person in the United States. And as I've already said, there is some evidence of Russia using this issue to sow division. So it's not, or the sort of media saliency of this issue is not about whether it's in any sense important to voters or not. There's lots and lots of polling in the United Kingdom that says that it's not a salient issue. So that 1 or 2% of people in the polls that I've seen say it's for them a kind of key voting issue. Um, it has become an issue because of the brute power of money and the really interesting question, I guess, is why all of this money is going into this issue.
Yeah, brute power of money, and also the press has just decided they're gonna talk about it no end and in a really hostile way. And there's a lot of people in the US who think that the way for the Democrats to claw back power is to give ground on cultural issues, particularly immigration, trans rights. They sometimes mention climate change in there. And my model of the world would say what people aren't getting mad about a direct experience of trans people or of trans activists, say. They're getting mad at a very hostile impression they're getting from media, and a very well-funded media, as you point out. So you're not gonna address that concern and win people back by making policy concessions because policy isn't what's causing it. That's not the root of the problem. And I think what you've seen in Britain is a really interesting and profoundly unsuccessful test run of that strategy in the Labour's approach, I think most associated with Starmer aide Morgan McSweeney, of we will move significantly to the right on immigration, we will move significantly to the right on trans rights. Um, and it hasn't worked at all. What's happened is they've antagonized their own coalition without peeling off votes from the centre right, which is exactly what my model of the world would suggest. Because people aren't responding to the reality of trans people in their lives, they're responding to media portrayals of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might, of course, all sort of binaries about politics are essentially false. I want to start by saying that it's important and we tend to overlook it. But having said that, I'm nevertheless going to offer one. I think the right has realized that voters experience politicians as deeply inauthentic, and so is giving very authentic messaging to voters, and voters are saying, "Look, I may agree with this, I may disagree with it, but at least these guys are telling the truth." And they hear what they hear from the left or from the centre left, or from centrists, and they think, why would I believe anything these guys say? They're they're forever triangulating. I mean, we can see what happened when the last Conservative government sought to meet the challenge posed by Reform, this sort of insurgent party further to the right of British politics than the Conservative Party. They sought to meet that threat by walking towards it, and it may well be that the Conservative Party will never recover from that decision. We're seeing Labour do exactly the same thing. They are seeking to counter the threat from reform by walking towards reform, and Labour is absolutely tanking in the opinion polls. A Starmer government, which has this enormous majority in Parliament, has sort of 11% net approval ratings. 11%, and we're less than 18 months into a 5-year term. I mean, it's really
It's remarkable.
extraordinarily unsuccessful as a political strategy. And again, you have to ask deep and searching questions why Labour is doing it. Because these are not stupid people. They might be mendacious, they might be amoral, but they're absolutely not stupid. They can see the opinion polls, they can see where Labour's votes are going to, and Labour is shedding hugely more votes to parties on the left than it is to Reform. Um, it's certainly not winning any voters back from Reform by tracking Reform's policies. And against that background, you have to ask why Starmer's government is doing this. What does it really want? What does it really believe? Does it even know?
This is the question I get asked the most by both actually UK and US audiences is do they not get it? Like why are they doing this? I mean, that's a separate conversation. I'll recommend I'll self-plug an article. My reactionary centrist article is my attempt to sort of sketch out an answer to that.
I
But
think
I
that's when I first began to read you, Toby. That
oh,
piece.
thank you. Um, but let's get back to the farm because, okay, so we had the first overreach, which was the Supreme Court case, and we've talked a bit about the context. The government is that Supreme Court case was then overread by both the EHRC and the government. Do you want to talk briefly about that second overreach and what that looked like and what that meant?
So, um, so when the decision came out, I had two conversations with two um, King's Counsel senior trial lawyers, specialists in this area. Neither of them sort of ideologically inclined on the issue. One of them said, um, we don't actually think this decision makes any difference at all to the state of the law. And the other said, this decision is going to have really profoundly negative consequences for trans people. Um, the point I'm trying to make is that no one knew, there was no settled view about what that decision means. And although nobody ever quotes this, the Supreme Court itself said in terms that the decision would not be disadvantageous to trans people. Um, the government would have been given that advice. The government uses extremely talented lawyers, some of them working in the same sets of chambers as barristers that I've referred to as having consulted myself. And it would have been told, look, we just do not know what this decision means. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take lots and lots of litigation before anyone knows. But it decided politically to adopt a very, very vigorously maximalist interpretation of the decision. So it said bathroom bans, so trans people couldn't use the right um, toilets. It said, I mean, Keir Starmer made some really strikingly broad comments that, on no view, followed from the decision of the Supreme Court. Neither of those two barristers with diametrically opposed views on what the decision meant would have agreed with the proposition that Starmer seemed to articulate, which was that it expressed something fundamental about the nature of what it was to be a woman. So,
Starmer interpreted it ontologically, not just legally. The Supreme Court has now decided what it means to be a woman, which was a remarkable statement for a country that doesn't have constitutional review.
and like one of the really striking things about Starmer when he became prime minister was the extraordinary warmth amongst barristers. People felt um, extraordinarily happy about him becoming prime minister. This is the legal community, right? And this is in particular the legal community that I'm friends with, who are kind of progressive, many of them liberal, um, interested in human rights, interested in dignity, he's committed to these issues. And they were universally, they had nothing but love for Keir, nothing but joy about this decent man becoming prime minister. Um, and all of them are now absolutely kind of gobsmacked at who he now seems to be, what he says, the language that he uses, his political strategy, the narrowness of the advisors who assist him, and it's almost like he's been occupied, he's been cuckooed, if you like, by somebody who is not Keir Starmer. It's all very, very difficult to understand this. genuinely universally loved figure amongst progressives and liberals is behaving in a way that is dumbfounding everybody.
Although I will say on the more sort of activisty side, which is my sort of corner of the woods, they had not liked him for a bit,
No,
you
and I
know.
didn't like him either. I sort of sit in that intersection, and your point is entirely right as well. I was deeply distrustful of him. I had seen that he'd been hollowed out. He was now monkey to somebody else's organ grinder. I didn't need to watch what he did as prime minister in order to know that. I thought that I knew that already. I'm just talking about what the legal community that isn't quite as politically engaged as you and I thought about him becoming PM.
I mean, I know he was very respected as a he was headed the Crown Prosecution Service, I
He
want to
did.
say. Yeah, yeah. I know he was very well respected there, had a very impressive career.
I'm not talking about the respect, though. I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about the
Hmm.
warmth, the kind of genuine affection, the stories about his decency, the absence of anybody with a kind of a bad word to say about him. You know, the bar um, is a profession like all others, which is catty like all others. And it was extraordinary what the legal profession thought about him
It's interesting.
then, Toby, what they thought about him
Hmm,
then.
I don't have a. It's an interesting insight. I don't have a good model of Keir Starmer's mind. I can talk in general about the narratives to which I think that, and sort of frameworks for politics to which I think that tribe subscribes. But people who are like, what switch flipped in his head? I don't know. I don't. I think politics by trying to mind read is sometimes a bit of a fool's game. I think it's what people do that matters. No, I've heard this before that he was very, very well respected and liked, and I don't know. I don't know. He's running with the wrong crowd.
An enigma wrapped in a mystery,
Yeah, yeah.
etc., etc.
Okay. So to bring us back up to speed, then we've got now um, the government signing off on a maximalist read of this court case, and then this body, the EHRC, signing off on a maximalist read of it. I read in full, which most journalists don't seem to have, both the interim guidance, which is very short, and then the code of practice or the consulting guidance, which is a bit longer. These are crackers documents. Like, these are not carefully drawn up legal things. These read like they were written by a telegraph writer, you know? Like, they're just very, okay, well, trans women aren't women, and so they shouldn't use the women's bathrooms. And then when they get through to what enforcement looks like, just jump straight off the deep end. I don't know if you've got anything to say on what is the current legal reality for the UK, supposedly.
Well, we still don't know what the legal reality is for the UK. Good Law Project is bringing a challenge to the interim guidance, which has turned de facto into a challenge to um, the EHRC's understanding of the law, and this is this is notionally guidance written for um, uh, duty bearers, which is a sort of handy shorthand for those who have obligations under equalities legislation. So, in particular, employers and service providers. And its notional purpose is to help them implement the For Some Women Scotland decision. And given that the EHRC's obligations include obligations to women and to trans people, you would expect them to be even handed. It doesn't even purport the interim guidance to do that. It talks about how um, employers should seek to protect the interests of women who are transphobic. I mean, in Britain, like I imagine everywhere else in the world, women are in fact much more trans inclusive than men are. But it talks at some length about how employers should deal with women who believe their rights are impinged upon by sharing spaces with trans people. It has nothing to say about how you protect, nothing meaningful to say about how you protect the rights and dignities of trans people. It deplatforms, it ignores, it renders invisible the much larger group of women who are pretty relaxed about sharing spaces with trans people, know that the real threat to their rights and dignity are cis men. Um, and and it makes some extraordinary statements. So it introduces the idea that it's unlawful for uh, trans women to use, for example, women's toilets. I mean, that's what I read the document as saying. I've read the piece you published a few days ago. It's what you read the document as saying. We've looked at
It's
hundreds and
it's
hundreds of law firms.
it's what the document does say.
Well, that's a very old-fashioned way of answering the question, Toby. Yes, it is what the document does say, read objectively by anybody whose first or even second language is English. But that reality is contested. Um, what the EHRC now says is that everybody who read those very plain words um, and took from them that it was unlawful for trans women to share spaces with cis women, misread those documents. That wasn't at all what the EHRC was saying, despite the fact that it actually is what the EHRC was saying.
So
Uh,
this results from the Good Law Project. Do you want to briefly say, just as context for listeners, what is the Good Law Project, and what is it that you're doing to challenge this guidance, this ban?
So we're sort of a bit like the ACLU for your US audience. We're a kind of progressive strategic litigator. We have about 40 staff. We have an income of about 5 million quid a year. Um, we're funded almost entirely by members of the public. So those giving us more than 10K a year make up about 15% or thereabouts of our income. Um, and we are, by some distance, the most active defenders of the rights and dignities of trans people in the UK, defending those rights at least through litigation. So we're probably looking at about 30 cases, and we're probably at some stage of in the legal process for maybe a dozen legal cases at the moment, possibly a bit more than that. We brought a so-called judicial review. This is the legal mechanic by which you challenge actions by public bodies of this interim guidance. In the course of the pleadings, so the formal cases that the parties have to state and then defend in a hearing, that hearing will take place 12th and 13th of November, if I remember correctly. The EHRC said this thing. It said that that which everybody had understood this document to say, it wasn't actually saying. You might be a cynic and you might think that what the EHRC is actually doing is conceding that what it said was wrong without having to admit that it was wrong. It's not that we got the law wrong; it's that everybody else misread what we initially said. But you emerge at the same point. You emerge at a point where the EHRC is now saying, in agreement with the law project, that there is no law that trans women should not share single sex spaces with cis women. If you adopt such a policy without a very good justification, you're going to be sued. Equally, unless you think about the consequences of including trans women in single sex spaces, you are at legal risk as well. The position is legally complicated. That's where they've now landed. It's not a terribly satisfactory position for those who have burdens, those who have responsibilities as service providers or employers, because they're going to be faced with years and years and years and years of litigation in relation to the issue. But that's what the Supreme Court seems to have done.
Will do you think that will have an impact? I mean, I do hope someone, a journalist who may be listening, will ask Starmer or Phillipson this at some point of like, does your interpretation of this still stand, given that's not what the EHRC is saying now?
Um, I mean, I don't want to give away too much of our case strategy. This is a case that is still
Of
ongoing,
course.
but it's absolutely true to say that, for reasons we haven't yet come on to, if a court finds that the EHRC got the law wrong, that will have quite a profound real life effect that won't follow from Good Law Project pointing out the difference between what the EHRC's initial interim guidance said and what the EHRC now says its initial interim guidance meant. What I'm referring to there, and we've been sort of dancing around this now
Mm.
for about 15 minutes, half an hour, is that there's also been an extraordinary push to create a unified narrative around this maximalist interpretation of the Supreme Court decision, to the effect that the Supreme Court decided that trans women are not women
Yeah.
for all purposes, beyond just the legal and beyond just the Equality Act, and that it's made life much, much simpler. And all of these questions, all of these problems are resolved. There's been an extraordinary push backed by J.K. Rowling's vast fortune, supported by money from the US evangelical right, probably supported by Russia as well, certainly supported by our very right-wing patriarchal press, to delegitimize, to end as an intellectual construct or a reality at all the notion of transness. So I sometimes talk about what's happening in Britain as being an effort to eradicate trans people. And people generally hear me when I say that as saying that transphobes want to kill all trans people. I don't actually mean that. I mean something subtler. I mean, I've had conversations, private conversations with some of these people on the other side, and they are often nearly indifferent to the deaths, the suicides of trans people. But what they really think is that transness is a pathology that society has indulged, and it should not indulge it any longer. I mean, it's very familiar to those who remember how we once talked about homosexuality. It was a perversion. It was an aberration. These people needed to be fixed, and not dignified. And that is the push in Britain as well. So this decision and this sort of maximalist reading, both in the legal and non-legal spheres, um, are all about delegitimizing the notion of transness as something worthy of respect, worthy of dignity, having any reality, being otherwise than a mental illness.
I talk from the dual national perspective, and as someone who lived in America for over a decade, I increasingly don't find people within the trans community or allies who talk about extermination or genocide as overstating the case. I think you accurately describe where most British transphobes are right now, in that they think it's a mental illness that society needs to stop humouring. But from the US case, like that will slide very quickly into talk of physical extermination. Like you'll go from one to the other, like without missing a beat. And now the American right does quite openly talk of physical extermination. And if you look at how the Trump administration is behaving in a number of respects, it would be very naive to put that past them. And, we're maybe not there yet in the UK, but I think we should not assume that there's some sort of guardrail or blocker that will just that the train will come to a natural stop. Like if you allow it to keep sliding, that is where it will go ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, there are. You can look at this world through any number of different lenses. You can look at it through the lens of political narrative or political direction of travel. You can also look at it through the lens of, what is the present on the ground reality for trans people. And there's a pretty good case to say that the on the ground present reality for trans people in Britain is worse than that in the United States. So
Very good case, I think.
I know as a fact that trans kids who joined the NHS waiting list are now being, or their families are being targeted by social services, threatening to take those children into care if their parents continue to indulge their transness, and are being visited by the police if they continue to offer gender affirming care. I know as a fact that puberty blockers, which are prescribed throughout most of the world as an entirely orthodox treatment for what we call, forgive me, it's a loaded term, gender questioning youth, to give them time to think during an adolescence that even for cis people is generally, often at least, pretty tumultuous, um, have been criminalized in the UK. So it is now a criminal offence to supply in the UK puberty blockers. That's not true throughout the United States. I'm not even sure whether it's true. Um, I expect it is true in some of the states of the United States, but it is true throughout the the United Kingdom. And I know for a fact that the consequence of that for some families is that kids are being forcibly detransitioned. And I know for a fact that in the UK, many, many families are profoundly worried about losing their kids to suicide. So parents are sleeping on mattresses at the end of their children's beds because they are so worried about what their children might do if given the opportunity. My email inbox, I'm afraid, is a river of profound trauma from loving families who are struggling to keep their children alive and who are being hounded by social services, hounded by the NHS, which is misusing data it has collected to offer supportive healthcare to these kids, and in some cases also being hounded by the police. I cannot imagine what it is like to be one of those families, and I've been saying now for several years. Um, and I say again to those who are lucky enough to have this choice, the United Kingdom is not a safe place to raise trans children unless you are um, very wealthy. I'm sorry to be so blunt about it, but these are things I know to be true, and I see the
I
trauma in my inbox.
I feel like, and this is perhaps informed by my personal perspective of someone who moved to America at the very beginning of the Trump era, a little bit before, in fact. I came to America 2011. And maybe perhaps just because I was something of an outsider to that society, saw a lot of the antecedents of Trump and was Tea Party, Gamergate, so on, was quite concerned by them. And has spent 10 years being told, you're overreacting. Look, Trump's a buffoon and he's a demagogue and whatever. But like, if you think we're going to transition into an authoritarian state, then you're being silly. And I've spent over 10 years, 15 years saying, no, no, this is a live option that is on the table. Like, I am just taking these people at their word of what they want to achieve in this world. Trans people was a part of that, but there are a number of sort of fronts to the American push. And then I moved back to the UK a few years ago, and we're right back in the same place. Like, this is, I think, in the British case, we're just not conceptualizing this as real unless you happen to have be trans yourself or have a trans child. There's, some minority of the country for whom it's very, very real. But for like your proverbial median voter, I don't know. I feel like when I say America has not is transitioning, has transitioned from liberal democracy to competitive authoritarianism. And that's something that is going to happen to us unless we change course. People look at you like you're an alien. And I will say this, I have spent 10 years being very frustrated with what I call American reactionary centrists, being like, oh, you're overreacting. I'll say this for them. I was asking them to imagine a hypothetical, something that has not occurred yet. And, that's outside of some people's imagination. In the UK, we can see it happening around the world. And we're just like just it's not going in. And it's already happening. Like we're already seeing profound illiberalism and authoritarianism, as you say, with parents who have a trans child. We're already seeing it here. We're
It
seeing
is.
it, we're seeing it writ large across other countries. You mentioned Russia, I've mentioned the US, there's plenty of others we can throw in. And I would say we are taking it less seriously. Our mainstream media, our mainstream liberal institutions, present company excluded, of course, um, are just public consciousness. We are taking it less seriously than America was in 2015 and 2016.
I mean, I think Toby, you know, a lot of the entities that were in that sentence that you used just a second ago, as being oblivious to encroaching authoritarianism are not oblivious to encroaching authoritarianism. They want it. They
Mm,
want it. And what they are doing is trying to make it more palatable
mm,
to voters who certainly are in that camp of uh, obliviousness to what's coming down the road. I mean, Good Law Project is already embarked on contingency planning to leave the United Kingdom in the event that Nigel Farage becomes our next prime minister. Because our base case is that it will be impossible for civil society to exist in the UK in the same way as presently it does. I mean, a pretty good um, endoscope into the current state of British politics comes from looking at what's happening to the European Convention on Human Rights and discourse around that. This is an international human rights document that has, I don't know, 100 or a little more than that, I think, signatory states. Um, Three countries, I think, have ever left it. Russia after it invaded Ukraine, Belarus, Greece temporarily after a right-wing military coup. Um, in the United Kingdom, it's now Reform Party policy to leave it. It's Conservative Party policy to leave it. And Labour is highly critical of it, which will launder um, the push to leave it of a successive
That's the bit
Conservative or Reform government.
that depresses me so much. Look, the right wing press are in the tank for fascism, sure, right? Like that's not good. Not saying it's good. Um, the Conservatives, God knows what they think they're doing, but they're not opposing it. Um, it's the lack of any sort of organised response on our side, again, present company excluded, that I find so depressing. Is for all their failings, of which there are many, and I have complained about them no end, the US Democrats were more resolutely opposed to this than Labour are. Easily. It's not even close, actually. Um,
Yeah.
there was more in the way of press opposition in the US. Again, I have my complaints there, but there was a liberal press. Increasingly not so much now. But I don't see that a sort of mainline liberal counterforce in the UK to anywhere near the same degree. I just don't.
So, I
Sorry, I'm
chat.
just subjecting you to some of my personal frustrations right
No, no, no.
now.
I entirely agree. And on trans rights, I chat from time to time to lots of the leading US figures. One of those US figures, I'm not going to name her, an extraordinarily um, powerful, heroic, brave voice, says that many of the leading Democrats are still doing vigorous advocacy for trans people because they have trans kids or they have trans grandkids and they want to be able to look them in the eye. But you and I, Toby, probably know of um, front bench Labour politicians, so members of the executive of that the Labour government makes up, who have trans kids, who are nevertheless adopting vigorously anti-trans positions in their public statements. I mean, that is, to me, that's a pretty good insight into quite how morally, ethically abject this Labour government is.
I unfortunately agree, and it's interesting because I have far more of an identitarian commitment to the Labour Party than I do the US Democrats. Like, I can count four generations of my British side of my family who've never done anything other than vote Labour, you know. Um,
I was an
but
advisor to the Labour Party in 2015. I was going to go in to number 10 and run tax policy for the Labour government when Ed Miliband won the general election in 2015. Of course, history is different from what we expected it to be, but I am not somebody who is some perpetually grumpy far left activist.
no, me either. Wasn't
They have made me, Toby. It's their fault. They have made me what
no.
I am.
No, they really, really have. And like, yeah, could we please have the moral and political courage of Joe Biden? That's where we're at, right? One of my favorite Biden quotes ever, he was asked by a sort of right-wing provocateur, how many genders are there? He said, and I quote, at least three, don't play games with me, kid. Like, what would you give to have Starmer have that much punch to him? Like, this is the thing. We're not asking for AOC, we're asking for Joe Biden here. You know?
It is so depressing. He has been cuckooed. The 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 man he was is no longer the man he is, and I'm sorry to bang on about it. And you're quite right to say that ultimately it's irrelevant. A politician is what a politician does, but it is still, uh, to me, an extraordinary mystery and an intrigue that he has become this um, abject, appalling um, figure in British politics.
Yeah. We're a bit over time, but just to close, what can people do? I think like one point that follows from our conversation is we should at least do what we can to make, and I'll put my shoulder to this certainly, to make it known that actually this isn't the official position anymore, at least in court. I think that can be publicized. What else can people do if people have listened to us and thought, you know what, these chaps are right, this is all nasty and scary and authoritarian. What can people be doing?
Yeah, so I've got two things. One very predictable. GLP is taking on authoritarianism. We have been for about a decade. You'll see what it costs if you type my name into Google. Please don't type my name into Google. Um, the pushback is pretty ferocious, and we do always need more support. The more meaningful thing, well, another meaningful thing is I've learned this from doing this work for the best part of a decade. Um, when somebody whose voice you admire is being attacked, when somebody you like is being attacked, reach out and offer them your solidarity and do it publicly. Um, I have behind me, hanging on the wall, a T-shirt. A friend of mine bought it from the Royal Academy summer exhibition. It says, "All relentless entities depend on your fatigue." It's a kind of Jenny Holzer does T-shirts thing. Um, the the sheer difficulty of continuing to do advocacy in the face of this authoritarian or fascist monster cannot be underestimated. And it's so important when people are under pressure to give them publicly your solidarity. You do not know how much it means, how necessary it is to receive that if you feel unable to carry on.
I'd agree with all of that. And reach out to people if you know someone who's directly impacted. Hey, how you doing? You know, um,
That's
and,
right.
and that goes for the US as well, actually, or any country where this is happening.
Remind them that they are human beings entitled to everything that these universal, indivisible expressions of human dignity comprised in these documents articulating international human rights norms are entitled to. They are entitled to dignity. They are entitled to respect. They are entitled to move safely through the public sphere. Remind them of those things because it is very, very easy to internalize the hate. I was in Winnipeg speaking at the National Human Rights Museum of Canada, and one of the floors in that museum is devoted, as you would expect it to be, to the Holocaust. And I was struck um, yet again by how the persistent mistreatment of Jews, the dehumanization of Jews in the ghettos, that was the example I had before me, um, leaves must leave people feeling less than human because you're covered in lice, you're skinny, you smell. There's no way you can go to have to use the toilet. Your clothes are filthy. You are reduced to a state that is in appearance subhuman, and I cannot understand how that physical appearance might do otherwise than impact on your own perception of yourself. So remind, um, for present purposes, trans people of their dignity, of their humanity, of their entitlement um, to your love.
Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Toby. That's been a really great conversation.